It was a regular afternoon for Officer Daniels as he drove down the quiet street. The sun was shining brightly, and the streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional car passing by. Officer Daniels had been on patrol for a few hours, his mind wandering as he watched the world go by. He was used to calm days like this, but he never knew when something unusual might happen. As he drove, Officer Daniels noticed a car in front of him swerving slightly from side to side. It wasn't much, just a small weave in the lane, but it was enough to catch his attention. The car didn't seem to have a clear purpose, almost like the driver wasn't paying attention. He decided to pull the car over and see what was going on. His lights flashed as the car slowly pulled to the side of the road. Officer Daniels signaled for the driver to stop, keeping his eyes on the car in case anything unexpected happened. He parked his patrol car behind the vehicle, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. This was routine, but even after all these years, he never let his guard down. You never knew what you'd face during a traffic stop. As he stepped out of his car and approached the driver's side, Officer Daniels couldn't help but notice the woman behind the wheel. She was probably in her late 30s, wearing a light blue shirt and jeans. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and her eyes were wide, almost as if she was afraid of being stopped. She quickly rolled down the window when he reached the car, giving him a nervous smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Daniels asked, trying to keep his voice calm and professional. The woman's eyes darted around as if she was searching for the right words. I'm not sure. Was I speeding?" she stammered. "I noticed you were swerving a bit in your lane," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Everything all right?" She nodded quickly, still seeming uneasy. "Yeah, just a little distracted," she explained, avoiding his gaze. Her hands were shaking as she handed him her license and registration. Officer Daniels took the documents, but something about the way she was acting made him feel suspicious. She wasn't just nervous, she was visibly shaken, almost as if she was hiding something. He tried to push the feeling aside, reminding himself not to jump to conclusions. It could be nothing. He glanced over at the passenger side, expecting to see a bag or something else that might explain her nervousness, but instead, his eyes landed on the back seat. That's when he noticed the little girl sitting quietly in the back. At first, he thought nothing of it, but as his gaze lingered on her, something didn't seem right. The little girl couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. She was sitting perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap. But it wasn't just her stillness that made Officer Daniels feel uneasy. It was her face. She had an odd expression, almost as if she wasn't paying attention to anything around her. Her eyes were wide, but they didn't seem focused on anything in particular. And her skin, which should have looked healthy for a child of her age, appeared unusually pale. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at her. Something about this didn't feel normal. He tried to keep his calm, but a cold feeling settled in his stomach. Officer Daniels had seen a lot in his career, but this felt different. There was something about that little girl that made his instincts flare up, telling him that something wasn't right. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew he had to be careful. "Ma'am," Officer Daniels said slowly, turning his attention back to the woman. "Could you tell me more about the little girl in the back seat?" The woman looked startled at the question, as if she hadn't expected him to focus on her daughter. But instead of answering right away, she hesitated, glancing at the girl in the rearview mirror. The pause felt longer than it should have. "Is she okay?" he asked, his concern deepening. But the woman remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Officer Daniels waited for a response, his eyes still on the little girl in the back seat. The silence in the car stretched on for what felt like forever. The woman's hands continued to grip the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. She seemed to be lost in thought, avoiding eye contact with the officer. It was clear that something was bothering her, but she wasn't ready to talk about it. The air was thick with tension, and Officer Daniels could feel it. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He was trained for moments like this, but the unease in his stomach told him something wasn't right. "Ma'am," Officer Daniels said again, his voice firm but kind, "is everything all right with the little girl in the backseat?" The woman's head snapped toward the girl, as if she had just remembered she was there. She quickly turned back to the officer, her face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. "She's fine," the woman said quickly, but her voice trembled. "She's just a little tired. We've been driving for a while." Officer Daniels didn't buy it. There was something in the woman's voice, something that didn't sit right. He had seen enough people trying to hide the truth to know when they were holding something back. But what could it be? He couldn't just let it go. The little girl's strange behavior and the woman's reaction had him on edge. He glanced down at the registration and license the woman had handed him earlier. The name on the documents didn't ring any bells. It wasn't a name he recognized from his patrols, and there were no red flags in the system. Still, the situation felt off, and his instincts told him to dig deeper. "Are you sure there's nothing wrong?" Officer Daniels pressed gently. "I've been trained to look for signs when something's wrong, and I can't shake the feeling that something's not right." The woman took in a shaky breath, and for a moment, Officer Daniels thought she might cry. Her face twisted in distress, and her eyes filled with tears. She blinked them away quickly, but it was clear that she was struggling. "I swear, officer, she's fine," the woman said, her voice now a little louder, more desperate. "She's just been acting strange lately, that's all. I've been trying to get her some help. I'm taking her to the hospital, okay? That's all." The officer's suspicion only deepened. If the little girl was sick, why wasn't she talking? Why was she so quiet, so still? And why did the woman seem so uncomfortable talking about her? It didn't add up. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the car," Officer Daniels said calmly. His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. Something wasn't right, and he needed to make sure the child was okay. He couldn't ignore the way the little girl had looked at him, like she wasn't really there. The woman's face went pale, and her eyes widened with alarm. For a moment, she hesitated, her hands still gripping the wheel tightly. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, she slowly opened the door and stepped out of the car. Officer Daniels kept his eyes on the little girl, still sitting silently in the backseat. He could feel his heart beating faster, his instincts screaming at him to stay alert. The woman wasn't being honest, and the little girl's condition was starting to feel more serious than just tiredness. As the woman stood by the car, Officer Daniels took a few steps toward the backseat, trying to get a better view of the little girl. She still hadn't moved. Her wide eyes stared ahead, her face pale and almost lifeless. Officer Daniels felt a knot form in his stomach. There was no way he could ignore it any longer. "Ma'am," he said again, this time more urgently, "is there something you're not telling me?" The woman swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the officer before turning her attention back to the road. "No, officer. I'm just trying to help her." But Officer Daniels wasn't convinced. Something was wrong, and he wasn't going to let it go. Officer Daniels's mind was racing as he stood beside the car, his eyes still focused on the little girl in the backseat. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The woman's nervous behavior and the child's strange stillness only made the situation more suspicious. Every part of him wanted to believe the woman's story, but something inside him told him to trust his instincts. The little girl hadn't moved a muscle since Officer Daniels had first seen her. Her small hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her legs were pressed together as if she was trying to make herself as small as possible. She sat with her back straight, her head slightly tilted, staring out of the window. Her face was pale, almost too pale for a child. Her skin didn't have the healthy glow that kids usually have, and her lips had a faint bluish tint. Officer Daniels took a deep breath, trying to calm the growing sense of dread that was building inside him. He had seen all kinds of things in his career as a police officer, but the stillness of this little girl was unsettling. Most children, especially at that age, were full of energy, asking questions or fidgeting in their seat. But this little girl, she was eerily quiet. Her large eyes stared into the distance, unblinking, as if she was lost in her own world. "Ma'am," Officer Daniels said again, his voice more serious this time. "Can I take a look at her? Is she all right?" The woman's face twisted with fear, and for a moment, it seemed like she was going to say no. Her eyes darted back and forth, looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. She could tell from the officer's tone that he wasn't going to back down. I don't know what's happening with her," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "She hasn't been herself lately. She's been acting distant. I don't know what's wrong." Her words were rushed, as if she was trying to explain without fully understanding what was happening. Officer Daniels could feel his heart beating faster. He stepped closer to the back of the car, his gaze never leaving the little girl. He needed to know if she was okay, but he was also starting to feel like something was terribly wrong. "Why is she so still?" Officer Daniels asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Is she sick? Has she been to a doctor?" The woman shook her head quickly. No. I'm trying to get her help. I just don't know what's going on. She used to be fine, but now, she's different." The officer didn't know what to make of her response. The child was still, but there was more to it than just illness. There was something unsettling about the way she sat there, almost as if she was in a trance. Officer Daniels couldn't ignore the sense of urgency in the pit of his stomach. He needed to act, but he had to be careful. "Ma'am, I'm going to call for some backup," Officer Daniels said, his voice firm. "We need to make sure she's all right. I can't just let this go." The woman's face went pale as she took a step back. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words never came out. It was as if the weight of the situation had finally hit her, and she knew that there was no way to hide what was happening anymore. Officer Daniels quickly radioed for help, requesting an ambulance and backup. His mind was spinning with questions. What was wrong with the little girl? Why was she so still? And why had the woman been acting so strangely? As he waited for the backup to arrive, Officer Daniels couldn't take his eyes off the little girl. Her expression never changed. It was as if she was locked in a world of her own, and no one could reach her. He had seen children go through traumatic experiences, but this felt different. This wasn't just a child who was sick or tired. Something was off, and he had to find out what. Officer Daniels stood by the car, his eyes fixed on the little girl in the backseat as he waited for backup. The tension in the air was thick, and his heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The silence from the girl, the woman's nervous behavior, it all felt like a puzzle he couldn't solve. As the moments ticked by, Officer Daniels noticed the woman's eyes shift nervously from side to side. She was fidgeting with her hands, twisting them in the fabric of her clothes, and occasionally glancing over her shoulder at the little girl. It was as if she was trying to avoid looking directly at the officer, or perhaps trying to think of what to say next. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the woman spoke again, her voice shaking slightly. "She's just tired, you know. She's been through a lot. I've been trying to help her, but I don't know what's going on with her." She let out a deep sigh, her voice filled with frustration. Officer Daniels leaned in slightly, trying to read her expression. There was something about her words that didn't sit right with him. She kept repeating how she had been trying to help the girl, but her actions didn't match her words. Why did she seem so uneasy? "How long has she been like this?" Officer Daniels asked, trying to get a clearer picture of what was happening. He had dealt with nervous parents before, but there was something different in the way this woman responded. The woman shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the backseat. "A few days, maybe longer. I'm not sure," she said, her voice trailing off. She was fine at first, but then, I don't know. She just started acting strange. Officer Daniels raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by strange?" She bit her lip, and for a moment, It seemed like she was struggling to find the right words. She won't talk. She's distant. It's like she's in her own world, like she's not really here, you know. The woman shook her head in frustration. It's like she's not the same little girl anymore. I don't know what happened. The officer could see the genuine worry in her eyes, but something about her story didn't add up. If the child had been acting strange for days, why hadn't the woman taken her to a doctor sooner? Why was she just now trying to get help? Before Officer Daniels could ask more questions, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. Help was on the way. He didn't want to let the woman get away with any more half-truths, but he knew he needed to be patient for now. As the ambulance and backup arrived, the woman's demeanor shifted once again. She straightened up, and for the first time since the traffic stop began, she met Officer Daniels's gaze directly. There was a flash of something in her eyes. Fear, guilt, or maybe even a little bit of relief. The paramedics quickly approached the car, and Officer Daniels stepped aside to let them take over. One of the paramedics leaned in and began speaking to the woman, asking her to step back while they checked on the child. But just as the paramedic opened the back door, the little girl stirred. Officer Daniels's heart skipped a beat as he watched her move for the first time since he had noticed her. She slowly turned her head toward the paramedic, her wide eyes locking onto his with an eerie calmness. The paramedic froze for a moment, unsure of what to do, and for a brief second, Officer Daniels thought the little girl might say something. But then she simply looked away, her gaze drifting out the window again. That's when the unease in the officer's stomach grew even more. Something was very wrong with this little girl, and he was about to find out just how deep the situation went. As the paramedics moved into action, Officer Daniels stood back, watching the scene unfold with a sense of urgency. The little girl was finally showing signs of movement, but the stillness in her eyes had only deepened the officer's sense of concern. He watched as the paramedics gently tried to communicate with her, asking her simple questions, but the girl remained unresponsive, staring blankly out of the window. One of the paramedics leaned toward the officer, a look of confusion on his face. "She's not talking. She seems disconnected," the medic said, his voice low, as if unsure of what to make of the situation. "We need to get her checked out right away." Officer Daniels nodded, his mind racing. He'd seen children go through trauma, but this was different. The girl's eyes were wide open, but they didn't seem to focus on anything at all. Her body was still, almost too still for a child, and her skin, though pale, seemed almost lifeless. The officer stepped closer to the paramedics, who were now gently helping the girl out of the backseat. Her legs dangled limply as they carefully supported her, her face remaining locked in a vacant expression. Despite her tiny frame, she felt heavier than she should have, almost as though her body had been drained of energy. Is she okay?" Officer Daniels asked, though the answer seemed clear. It was more of a reflexive question as he watched the girl being moved. "She's unresponsive," one of the paramedics replied, his brow furrowed. "There are no obvious injuries, but this doesn't look normal. We'll have to run some tests." The woman who had been driving the car stood by, her face pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked like she was trying to hold it together, but Officer Daniels could see the tears welling up in her eyes. There was a lot she wasn't saying, and now it seemed as though the truth was starting to come out. "Is there anything you haven't told us?" Officer Daniels asked gently, his eyes locked on the woman. His voice was calm, but there was a note of urgency beneath it. The more he saw, the less he trusted her explanation. The woman swallowed hard and stepped closer to the officer, wringing her hands nervously. I don't know what's happening with her," she stammered. "I just found her a few days ago. She wasn't like this before." At the mention of found her, Officer Daniels felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Found her. What did that mean? Had this little girl been abandoned? Why was the woman so hesitant to give more details? "Found her," Officer Daniels asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Where did you find her?" The woman looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She was just there, she said quietly, her words trailing off. She looked as though she wanted to say more, but she hesitated, unsure of how to explain the situation without revealing something she wasn't ready to admit. The officer's suspicions grew. This wasn't just a simple case of a sick child. There were layers to this story that hadn't been told yet, and Officer Daniels was determined to uncover the truth. The paramedics carefully loaded the little girl into the ambulance, and Officer Daniels stepped back, his eyes never leaving the woman. The unease that had been growing inside him was now fully formed. There was something deeply wrong with this situation, and he wasn't about to let it go. "Ma'am," he said firmly, his voice steady, "I need you to come with me. We'll get to the bottom of this." The woman didn't argue. She simply nodded, her face filled with a mix of fear and guilt. As she climbed into the patrol car, Officer Daniels couldn't help but feel that the answers he was searching for were just beginning to unfold. The little girl had a story, and he was going to find out what it was, no matter what it took. The ambulance sped away, its sirens fading as Officer Daniels stood by the side of the road, watching the taillights disappear. The woman had been placed in the back of his patrol car, her silence only adding to the heavy atmosphere. It was as if she had retreated into herself, unwilling or unable to provide more information. Officer Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but every time he asked the woman a question, she gave him half answers and vague details. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and he needed to put them together quickly. As the officer drove behind the ambulance, his thoughts continued to race. What had really happened to the little girl? Why was she unresponsive? Why had the woman seemed so nervous, so unwilling to share the truth? Officer Daniels had a lot of questions, but there was no clear answer yet. The only thing he knew for sure was that this wasn't a typical traffic stop. When they arrived at the police station, Officer Daniels led the woman to a small interrogation room. She sat down slowly, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the situation had finally caught up with her. The officer took a seat across from her, trying to remain calm but unable to hide the urgency in his voice. "Ma'am, I need you to be honest with me," Officer Daniels said, looking directly into her eyes. "What happened to that little girl? Where did you find her?" The woman blinked rapidly, a nervous twitch in her hands as they gripped the edge of the table. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then hesitated. For a moment, it felt like she was wrestling with herself, struggling to decide whether or not to reveal the truth. "She wasn't always like this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go." The officer leaned forward, his patience thinning. "What do you mean? Where did you find her?" The woman looked away, her eyes darting around the room. She clearly wasn't ready to open up, but the officer wasn't going to let her off that easily. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "I found her in an abandoned house," the woman finally admitted, her voice trembling. "She was just sitting there, all alone. It was like she'd been left there for days, maybe longer. I don't know who she is, or where she came from. I didn't know what to do." The officer's heart sank. An abandoned house. That was not a good sign. It sounded like the little girl had been left behind, and from the looks of it, she had suffered for it. "I couldn't just leave her there," the woman continued, wringing her hands nervously. "I brought her home with me. I tried to take care of her, but she wasn't right. She wasn't acting like a normal child. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't even look at me. It was like she was lost." The woman's face contorted with emotion, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I tried, I really did. I thought if I kept her with me, she would get better. But she didn't. She just got worse." Officer Daniels felt a wave of sadness wash over him as he listened to the woman's story. It was clear that she was frightened, but the more she spoke, the more the situation seemed to spiral out of control. The little girl had been abandoned, left alone in a house, and now she was unresponsive and distant. Something had happened to her, something the officer was determined to understand. "I didn't know what to do," The woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could fix it, but I can't. I'm scared, officer. I'm scared for her." Officer Daniels sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The woman's story was more complicated than he had imagined. The little girl hadn't just been neglected. She had been left in a place where no one cared for her. But who had left her there? And why? There were more questions to be answered, and Officer Daniels wasn't going to stop until he had the truth. But for now, he had to make sure that the little girl was safe and that she would get the help she needed. And as for the woman, well, her story was just beginning to unravel. Officer Daniels sat at his desk, reviewing the information they had gathered so far. The woman, whose name turned out to be Emily, had been taken to a holding cell, and the paramedics were still running tests on the little girl at the hospital. The child, whose name Emily had said was Lily, had shown no signs of improvement since the officer had first seen her. Her strange behavior was still puzzling, and the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. As he sat there, his mind replayed the conversation he'd had with Emily. She had been clearly distressed, but her story wasn't adding up. How had she come across the child in the first place? Why had she waited so long to seek help? Why didn't she report finding Lily earlier, especially if the little girl had been so unwell? There were so many questions and not nearly enough answers. Officer Daniels knew there was something more to this than just a case of neglect. As much as he wanted to focus on getting Lily the help she needed, he couldn't ignore his duty to uncover the full truth behind what had happened. His radio crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. "Officer Daniels, we need you to come to the hospital. We've got some updates on the girl," the voice on the other end said. His heart skipped a beat. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, feeling a rush of adrenaline. Whatever was happening with Lily, it was clear they were no closer to understanding the full story. The hospital was only a short drive away, but every second felt like an eternity as Officer Daniels raced to get there. When he arrived, a nurse quickly met him at the entrance. "Follow me," she said, leading him through the sterile hallways. She brought him to a small room where Lily was lying in a bed. The child was hooked up to various machines, but her wide, empty eyes still stared off into space. Officer Daniels couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness. How had things come to this? The doctor in the room, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, turned toward Officer Daniels. "She's physically stable now, but she's still unresponsive. There's no sign of trauma, but emotionally and mentally, she's completely withdrawn. We're still running tests, but so far, we haven't found anything that could explain this behavior." The officer nodded, his heart heavy with concern. "What do you think happened to her?" The doctor sighed, clearly conflicted. "It's hard to say. It could be a result of extreme neglect or trauma, but there's something strange about her condition. It's almost as if she's been emotionally detached from reality, like she's in a trance, or like her mind has been completely closed off." Officer Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. The word trauma echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a case of neglect. Lily had suffered something deeper, something that had left her unable to connect with the world around her. The officer couldn't help but wonder what had caused her to retreat into herself like this. As he stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, he realized that Emily's story wasn't just suspicious, it was starting to look like a cover-up. She had found the girl, but how had Lily ended up in the condition she was in? Why had she been abandoned in the first place? The more Officer Daniels thought about it, the more he was certain that there was something Emily wasn't telling him. It was clear she was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before he figured out what that was. For now, though, his focus had to be on Lily. She was the innocent one in all of this. Whatever had happened to her, Officer Daniels vowed to find out the truth and make sure she got the help she needed. The road ahead was unclear, but he was determined to bring justice to the little girl who had been left to suffer in silence. As he left the hospital room, Officer Daniels knew that this case was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And with every new piece of information, he could feel the weight of the truth pressing closer. Officer Daniels stood in the hospital corridor, his mind racing. Lily, the little girl who had been found abandoned, was still under observation. Though she was physically stable, there was no sign of her awakening from the eerie silence that had taken over her. The doctors couldn't explain what was happening, and they were continuing to run tests. But Officer Daniels felt a growing sense of urgency. He couldn't ignore the fact that there was more to Lily's story than anyone was letting on. He made his way back to the police station, where Emily was still being held for questioning. The more he thought about her story, the more pieces of the puzzle didn't fit. Emily had claimed to find Lily in an abandoned house, but the officer couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him. Why hadn't she reported finding the girl earlier? Why did it take so long for her to seek help? As he entered the interrogation room, Officer Daniels found Emily sitting silently, her eyes red from crying. She hadn't spoken much since they brought her in, but Daniels knew that it was time to get the truth. "Emily," the officer began, his voice firm but compassionate, "I need you to tell me everything. I know you're scared, but I can't help you unless you're honest with me." Emily looked up at him, her face pale and strained. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, as if she were struggling to find the words. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers twisting the fabric of her shirt. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted things to go this far." "Emily, you need to tell me what happened," Officer Daniels said, his voice steady. "Where did you find Lily? Why wasn't she in a safe place?" Emily took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging. She looked down at her hands, her face filled with guilt. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "She wasn't just abandoned, officer," she said, her voice shaking. "Lily, she was running. She was running from something. I don't know exactly what it was, but I could tell. When I found her, she was scared. She wouldn't let me get too close, like she was trying to hide from something." Officer Daniels leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? Hiding from something?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "I don't know who did it, but I think someone hurt her. I think someone was chasing her." The officer's heart sank. It wasn't just neglect. There was something darker at play here. Someone had hurt Lily, and it was clear Emily knew more than she was letting on. "Why didn't you call the police when you found her?" Daniels asked, his voice sharp. "Why didn't you get her the help she needed right away?" Emily looked up at him, her face filled with regret. "I didn't know what to do. I was afraid. I thought if I helped her, maybe she'd be safe. But the more time passed, the more strange things became. She wouldn't talk. She wouldn't respond to anything. I thought maybe she just needed time. But when she got worse, I didn't know how to fix her." Officer Daniels's mind raced with the new information. It seemed clear now that Lily hadn't just been neglected. She had been running from something that had frightened her deeply. Emily's fear and guilt were real, but it was also clear that she hadn't been truthful with him from the start. "Emily," the officer said, his voice low, "I need you to tell me everything. The truth. This isn't over. Whatever happened to Lily, I'm going to find out, and I'm going to make sure she gets the justice she deserves." Emily's face crumpled, and for the first time since they began the interrogation, she began to cry. The weight of the situation seemed to finally crash down on her, and the officer could see the guilt and fear in her eyes. She was hiding something, and Daniels was determined to uncover it. As the officer left the room, his thoughts were swirling. Whoever had hurt Lily was still out there, and time was running out. But he knew one thing for sure. He was getting closer to the truth, and when he found it, he would make sure that Lily was no longer running from whatever had haunted her. The following day, Officer Daniels spent hours reviewing the case files, trying to piece together the information he had gathered. Emily's story about finding Lily in an abandoned house and the strange behavior she had described didn't sit well with him. He knew something important was still missing. He had to keep pushing, no matter how difficult it was. After reviewing Lily's medical records from the hospital, the officer discovered something that made his heart race. Despite her unresponsiveness, there was a small faint mark on Lily's wrist. It wasn't from an injury, but it seemed familiar. He had seen something like it before. A symbol, faint and barely noticeable, but enough to raise a red flag. He immediately asked his team to trace any possible connections to the symbol. What followed was a shock. The symbol was linked to an underground organization, a group that had been known for taking children from vulnerable situations and hiding them away, often without any trace. Officer Daniels' heart sank. This wasn't just a case of neglect. Lily was part of something far darker than he had ever imagined. The investigation picked up pace as Officer Daniels dug deeper. He spoke to more witnesses, checked surveillance footage, and connected more dots. His instincts were right. Lily had been part of an underground trafficking ring. But the question remained, why had Emily, someone who seemed so innocent, been involved? The breakthrough came when a phone call tipped them off. A local store owner remembered seeing Emily with a young girl, but the strange thing was, she had mentioned that they were leaving a building known for housing troubled individuals. That building, he learned, was connected to the underground network. This led Officer Daniels to an important discovery. Emily wasn't just a bystander. She had been part of the larger plan, whether knowingly or unknowingly. After speaking with Emily again, this time with all the pieces on the table, she finally broke down and told him everything. She admitted that she had found Lily during one of her visits to the building. She wasn't the child's savior as she had originally claimed. She had been caught in the web of the organization. Emily had been manipulated into believing she could help, but instead, she had only made things worse. She had taken Lily without fully understanding the consequences, thinking she could protect her from the horrors within the building's walls. "I didn't know," Emily sobbed, her voice cracking. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want to leave her there. I couldn't just walk away." Officer Daniels listened in silence, realizing the complexity of the situation. Emily wasn't the villain, but she wasn't entirely innocent either. She had been part of something she couldn't understand until it was too late. With the truth finally out, the investigation turned into a rescue mission. The officers tracked down the underground operation and worked with federal agents to dismantle the organization. They found more children, all of them in similar states of neglect, and they made sure they were brought to safety. As for Lily, after weeks of treatment and care, she slowly began to open up again. The healing process was slow, but she was no longer trapped in the silence that had consumed her. Though the scars would take time to heal, she was no longer running from the dark place she had been hidden in. In the end, Officer Daniels knew the case wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about giving a voice to those who had none. It was about protecting the innocent, even when they couldn't protect themselves. And as for Emily, while she faced legal consequences, she also found a way to make amends by helping the authorities bring down the network that had taken so many children. The road to healing was long, but for Lily and the others rescued from that horrible world, it was the first step toward a new beginning. And for Officer Daniels, it was a reminder of why he became a police officer in the first place, to uncover the truth and bring justice to those who needed it most.